Namaste everyone. Welcome to Bodhi Surf Yoga, and today we're going to start our online program of the 8 limbs of yoga. So we need to go back in history and realize where these 8 limbs of yoga are coming from before we start learning about each one of them. And in order to do that, we have to go back, some people say about 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, even 7,000 years ago. That's a little bit of a mystery. Where does yoga come from? The Yoga Sutras, which is the text we are going to get into to understand the 8 limbs of yoga, it's not the only it's not the only source of information that we have from yoga. The first information we have from yoga comes from the Vedas. The first Veda that ever existed, it's called the Rig Veda. And the interesting thing about this is that Rig Veda was not a written text, it's actually oral information. Where does this oral information came from? It came from supposedly people went and meditate and they received this information. And so the Vedas are like bursts with information about how to reach enlightenment that were passed from one person to another. They will memorize the Vedas and pass the information to the next generation. And it's funny because when I learned in my first teacher training about where does yoga come from, the first source is the Vedas. And you think about just this moment in time. But actually between the first Veda and the last one, there's a gap of 1,500 years. So obviously the information, as everything that happens in the world, transform, evolve, and change a little bit. And so after that, few texts, important texts came, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and the Yoga Sutras. And this is the one that we're going to use as the center of information for studying the 8 limbs of yoga. The 8 sutras are written by Patanjali. But Patanjali, it's a mythical character. It's a sage, and supposedly Patanjali comes from a snake. It's really nice if you see the statue of Patanjali, you see a person with a snake as well. Maybe we will dedicate another session about why the snake and the person, because I'm trying to be brief in this moment, but this is Patanjali. I have been studying the Yoga Sutras for a while, and some of the teachers said that maybe the Yoga Sutras come from different people, different sages. The Yoga Sutras have 4 chapters, and some scholars who studied the Yoga Sutras said that the last chapter is quite different from the first one. So it was probably written in a different moment in time, and also built by different people, different sages. Anyways, now let's move to the Yoga Sutras. This is a book that is referred as the Bible of yoga, because it contains, first, what is the meaning of yoga, and second, what is the path of yoga. So it's a book that the sutras means threads. It's one verse after another that have a lot of information, a lot of content. So we have, as I said, in those Yoga Sutras, 4 chapters. The first chapter, I would put it as it finds the definition of what yoga is about. Actually, I would say that the second sutra, Yoga Sita Vritti Nirodha, has actually the explanation of what yoga is. But if you don't understand the whole Yoga Sutras, then that definition is kind of confusing. When I'm saying Yoga Sita Vritti Nirodha, in a simple definition, translation is that yoga is the cessations of the fluctuations of the mind. And of course, when I first learned this, I was like, oh, this is hard. So it means that we're going to start thinking. Well, at the beginning is more like about slowing down, be more present, and pay more attention. What is it that we're thinking? And why are we thinking what we're thinking? Instead of just letting every thought arise without questioning it and just let it control our lives. So In the first chapter, going back to the first chapter, it's a lot about meditation and contemplation and the whole definition of yoga. In that first chapter, we find mostly the definition of what yoga is and description of meditation and contemplation. In the second chapter, this is the one that we're going to center the attention. Why? One thing interesting about these Yoga Sutras is that it's a very scientific and pragmatic way of information is provided. In the first part, Patanjali comes and say, we suffer. He says the causes of suffering, and he is really good. And well, the text, the Yoga Sutras, is really good about locating the reasons of why we suffer. They are actually compiling to 5 reasons why we suffer, and it's all about the ego, the ignorance, and the fear. And then on the next part, it says, yes, we suffer. Yes, we suffer unnecessarily, and here's what you can do about it. And that's the second chapter, and that's where we're centering the attention. So this is when the limbs of yoga show up, because it's then when the book of the Yoga Sutra says, yes, we suffer, and this is a path, and these are ways that we can use to decrease the amount of suffering, or to eradicate the amount of suffering. These are called the Ashtanga limbs. Ashtam means 8, Anga means limbs, the 8 limbs of yoga. 8 steps that we can do to follow the path of yoga, which is really interesting because we can see in the Yoga Sutras that we're provided with 2 things: yoga as a definition and as a goal, and yoga as a path, as a journey. These limbs are the way to go about for yoga as a path, as a journey. And now, of course, when we read the Yoga Sutra, sometimes it can feel a little bit complex, especially if you're studying the practice of yoga. But what I have realized over time of studying is that you can always study them and see how it applies to your life. Many of the things that were said, that were established on the Yoga Sutras, or even in some of the Yoga Sutras books that we're gonna take, are coming from writers like Swami Satchitananda, and they were using different times for different application. So the way we're going to perceive this course is we're going to use the 8 limbs of yoga and how it applies into our lives, the way our current lives are. For people like us living in the modern world, in a city, or maybe not, but how with families, with business, or working, or things like that. So how do we apply the information that was given in the Yoga Sutras and in the end of limbs of yoga, and we bring it into our regular daily life? That is what we're gonna do. One important thing before we begin is to understand when in the modern world, the concept of yoga is mostly seen as the concept, first of all, of asana practice, the physical yoga, postural yoga, we call it too. The movement, the bending in different directions. And that is part of yoga, but it's not what yoga is. It's actually the 3rd limb of yoga. And we'll go about it in very good detail. Why was the reason of the asana practice, and why it was important, and why it is important. And we will understand many things about it. Other people might take it as not only that, but the breathing, which is really important, and we'll go over that as well, because breathing is an essential component, is another limb of yoga, is the 4th limb of yoga. Then other people related with the asana practice, the breathing practice, and meditation. And yeah, I highly value meditation, it's very important. But even before that, there's other limbs to start practicing, and those are about how we behave towards the world and our internal world. These are called Yamas and Niyamas. And one of the things I have felt in the practice of yoga is that we tend to jump right up into asana without even knowing that this exists. And I found that is very valuable information. So the order of this course might change. It might be different than other courses you have done, where the most important is the breathing or the asana. You might be wondering, where is the breathing in all this? When are we going to get explanation? We'll get through this. But we're going to start first with the first limbs of yoga, which is the yamas, which are external observances, and niyamas, internal observances. We will move to the lovely asana practice, but we will understand this asana practice as a healing practice, not as a workout. We will work on the breathing, the essential part of the breathing, and understand why it is so important in the practice. And then we will move to one of the most complex parts for some, intimidated for others, but very, very, very important, meditation, different levels of meditation. Because at the end, the 8 limbs of yoga, the important thing to understand the 8 limbs of yoga, it starts with the most tangible things that we can do in a spiritual path to the more subtle energetic things. So we go step by step. I heard from one teacher that this is very important. The first limbs of yoga are things we can do. And then we start moving into less intangible things, and those are things that we try to practice, but they will come. So when I'm talking about the other 4 limbs, it's different levels of, from concentration to meditation and to samadhi. So let's start learning about the practice of the 8 limbs of yoga. Namaste.